Californians, when the Boone Dam repair project was underway, the former TVA public relations person, Ms. Miller, had informed me after a presentation from the chief engineer out there that there were lots of other programs within the TVA that would be of interest to our club, probably. So Lana Moore and I got the contact, and she hooked me up here with Michael Hicks. Michael is a Kingsport native, went to Sullivan South High School. He's stationed in Knoxville now, TVA. He works in the River Forecast Center, which is located in downtown Knoxville. It's a 24/7 operation. It's responsible for coordinating and managing the dynamic Tennessee River system. He's a licensed professional engineer with over 10 years of experience and has a Master of Science in Water Resources Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Tennessee. So welcome the hometown guy today. Quantas, give Michael Hicks a hometown welcome here.
How's everyone doing today? Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be back in my hometown, having the opportunity to give a presentation, talk a little bit about what we do in the River Forecast Center at a very high level. If you're like me, kind of growing up here, we always know the dams are here and we know they have a certain aspect in our lives and how they impact us in a certain way. But it's really kind of hard to know like the ins and outs of behind the scenes what's going on. And so I'm kind of hoping in the 20 minutes that I have to talk to you today that you'll have a much better feel for what's going on behind those scenes and maybe a little bit better understanding of why we do things in a certain way. So without further ado, I'll get started. So Tennessee Valley Authority was created in 1933 through an act of Congress, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act. Regarding that act, it was established for two primary reasons. It was for navigation and flood control. At the time, there were a lot of major issues with flooding in the Tennessee Valley. So streams would overflow and it made the region just totally uninhabitable. So Congress acted and created the TVA primarily for those two reasons. As a consequence of having the control over flood control and building dams, they also have the ability to generate power at these dams. So hydroelectric facilities were kind of new at the time and they've been around for a little bit. So it's kind of like we have these two primary objectives of navigation and flood control. We're going to go ahead and generate power with these dams if we can. And on the right here we have Senator George Norris from Nebraska, who was integral in the founding of TVA. So on this slide, I like to show a picture of the very first dam that TVA built. Does anybody recognize it? This is Norris Dam. It's up in Anderson County, just north of Knoxville. On the left, you can see it under construction, and then on the right, you can see it as it is today from the exact same vantage point. So it's really neat to see these historical photos, how before the river was ever closed and the lake wasn't there, that's what it was. We had all these natural rivers, and then we came in, constructed these dams, and the main reason was for the benefit of the people in the valley. So this is a map of the Tennessee River system as it stands today. There are a network of dams. There are 29 hydroelectric dams, meaning they have the ability to generate power. And then there are also 20 dams that are non-power, and they have various other purposes like water supply or helping with flood control as well, but they don't have hydroelectric generation in them. We also have one facility in Chattanooga area called Raccoon Mountain, which is a pump storage facility, and that's a really up-and-coming topic. It's very, very valuable to us, and we'll answer more questions about it later, but pump storage is a very good thing that provides a lot of flexibility for our system. So you can see in the top right corner, we just have a little subset area of the entire system here. The red circle there is this area. There are 4 dams that come to mind. You got Boone, Fort Pat, South Holston, and Watauga. We also have some other dams here like Clear Creek and Beaver Creek up in Virginia. And then we have Wilbur Dam, which is another smaller dam just below Watauga that a lot of people forget about, but it's also a very big part of our system. And then just to the west of here, near Morristown, we have Cherokee Dam. So those are the ones that are kind of relevant to this area. On this map, you can see two shades of yellow. It might be a little hard to see, but the shade in the middle that's a lighter color is the Tennessee River system. So that's any water that's collected within that boundary, makes its way down the Tennessee River from the east side of the valley to the west side into the Ohio River. The darker yellow you see there is the Tennessee Valley Authority Power Electric Service Fence. So anything in that boundary is where TVA provides power and sells that wholesale to local utilities, which then you have for your electric bill. So this area is kind of unique where the boundary is a little divided for that service area. I believe that part of Kingsport is actually on AEP, and then the boundary meanders a little bit. So it's not clear cut in this area, but we're all around. All of the dams are definitely within the Tennessee Valley River Basin, though. And this is just another slide showing how this cluster of dams in this area, they're kind of positioned here on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and the Tennessee River watershed is really large. It's like over 40,000 square miles, and the Tennessee River is about 652 miles long. So it's a very, very large system. We cover 7 states, and this area plays a very important part of the overall big picture. So this comes into play of like what I do for my job. I work in the River Forecast Center, and it's a 24/7 operations where our job is to maintain a control room where we dictate what goes on with the river system. It rains at any given time of the day, so we have to have people there who are monitoring these dams and the rivers to make sure that nothing's out of check and that everything is safe and operating smoothly. So we do a lot of modeling. We have a lot of technical aspects of the work, but we also answer public calls and we initiate emergency responses. So Boone Dam, I'm sure you're familiar with that in the past, how that was an issue there. An example of how that would come into play with us is an observer would notice something in a site and they call us, and then we kick off an emergency action plan to take action. So we do serve a multi-purpose role, and we're always there. So for that 24/7 staffing reason, we're a very good resource to kind of get people in touch with other areas within TVA. So we have a bunch of primary objectives that we try to balance in the River Forecast Center. There are 6 of them, and the first 3 were mentioned in the TVA Act itself on the very first slide. So navigation, flood damage reduction, and power generation, those have historically been the bread and butter of TVA. But over the years, TVA wasn't just developed for that purpose. We also kind of expanded into benefits for the people of the valley, which includes water supply, recreation, and water quality. And so now I'm going to kind of go through each of these objectives and explain, what it is that we have our hands on and like what we're doing to try to accomplish meeting these objectives. So how do we accomplish that? Well, from my perspective, it's mainly through the use of the dams, the network of projects that we have in our system, and how we utilize each of them and how they're designed with a very specific purpose in mind. An example of a tributary storage dam would be like Boone, which is in the top left corner there. That's a picture of Boone. There are 2 more in this area, which are South Holston and Watauga. These dams are very large and they hold a lot of water. We also have the run-of-the-river dams, which is like Fort Patrick Henry. It serves a lot of important purposes too, but its main reason is not to store a lot of water. It can actually generate power. It also can provide minimum flows for Eastman, so there's other purposes, and this is just an example, but in this area, these are the ones that we have. But across the system, there's a lot of other dams just like this. We have Beaver Creek in the bottom right, which is essentially a large detention pond. If you all are familiar with what those are, it's usually dry, it doesn't have a lot of water behind it, but if it rains really hard, it stores the water for us and it helps with flood damage reduction. So in the top right corner, just in Knoxville, we have Fort Loudon Dam. That is the first dam on the Tennessee River as it forms, where the confluence of the South Holston meets with the French Broad. So main river dams are unique because they all have navigation locks. And that's kind of what I'm going to get into next, is the navigation aspect of one of our objectives. So on the left, you see one of the locks. What a lock is, it's just a chamber where you can pull in, and they just operate some valves, and it raises and lowers the water levels. So anybody can operate a lock and get into them. So you could actually pull up in a canoe and go through a lock if you're ever in one of these dams. But you know, they also have a lot of barge traffic that goes through there, which is their primary use. TVA owns the dams, but they don't operate the locks. The Army Corps of Engineers operates them. And I mentioned that already Fort Loudon was the first one on the Tennessee River, and it goes all the way down from east to west, down to Kentucky Dam, which is the last one before it empties into the Ohio River. So we actually have a navigable channel from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Knoxville. That's extremely, extremely valuable for economic development and just commodity traffic in general. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that here. We were having some conversations about, you know, railroads and what the benefits of those are, how you can kind of eliminate trucks on the road through railway, but barges are the same way. And I actually have a great slide that kind of compares those. So on a single barge, you can get 15 rail cars, and then you can also get about 60 trucks off the road. So it's a very, very efficient way of moving commodities that are really large and heavy, and it's an extremely good benefit and low impact to the environment. And just quickly to show like what proportion of commodities are moved through the navigation system, coal and coke is the vast majority of it. You know, coal's for burning for energy, other purposes, and coke is a product used to make steel. And then aggregates would be like mixes and concretes and things like that. So does anybody recognize this picture or where this is? Chattanooga, that's right. So this is, I believe, Lookout Mountain, and we're looking at the fork and the bend of the Tennessee River right as the interstate comes through. And this is the same exact location in 1867 at one of the worst floods in history of that area. So this is Chattanooga completely underwater before TVA was built. The stage at that flood was 58 feet. So this was considered a major, major flood. And one of the primary driving reasons why TVA was created and exists. Today, we don't really see things like this anymore. I like to say because we do a really good job. You know, our job is to try to mitigate the flood damage as much as possible so that something like this doesn't happen. So if you don't see any flooding, you know, we're doing our job right. But again, I just think that's a crazy slide, how you can see, you know, a normal day and then underwater. So without getting into all the technicals and specifics, basically there's some driving things that cause this to happen. The water cycle, when things, you know, it rains on average throughout the year, about 51 inches of rainfall, and then on average, a portion of that rainfall will run off into what we call like flood-producing waters. It goes into the reservoirs, makes its way over the surfaces of the land, and you see that as floodwater. So a portion of that happens, but 60% of that happens only in 4 months of the year. So those 4 months are January through April. Now, can y'all think about why that might happen? Snowmelt, that's a good point. You know, you don't have plants as well in the winter, so the plants aren't there to take up the water, makes the soil more saturated at all times. So the soil acts like it's a big old sponge, and you know, when it's hot and dry, it absorbs a lot of that water. But during these wet winter months and cold winter months, the capacity to produce a lot of flood runoff is much, much higher. So that fundamental thing dictates a lot of the way we operate our reservoir system. This is just a chart showing kind of average rainfall totals compared to the runoff totals. So the blue bars is rain. You can see throughout the year, rain is pretty consistent. It's about the same, plus or minus some. But what really drops off in those summer months is the runoff, which is the green bar, because you can see the you know, evaporation and the plants taking up the water. So it really drops off in those summer months, but then the runoff really picks up from January to April. So how does all this play together and what we do to reduce flood damage? We have 3 phases of a flood control operation. The first phase is we look and use scientific tools from the National Weather Service like QPF estimates, which is a prediction of rainfall, of how much we might actually get. And we kind of watch that as an event is coming up, and it helps us determine like how do we prepare for that rainfall event. If we have high confidence, 3 days out, we might start operating our reservoirs to make some room and move some water out, so that way we actually have the capacity to absorb it. And then in the second stage of a flood control operation, we actually turn off these dams, particularly those tributary storage dams that I mentioned earlier, so that they hold all that water back. And that way, by holding the water back, we're mitigating the downstream runoff from that rainfall event. So all you should be seeing right there is what's raining. Everything else is stored in the reservoir. So once the event has passed, then we start slowly releasing it. So if y'all have ever seen after a rainfall event, like the dams are just releasing tons and tons of water, that's exactly why we're doing that. It's because we're passing that for flood storage recovery. And you can see on the right, the graphic there that has the light blue spike. That's kind of what it would look like without dams in place. You see this large slug of water, and then it kind of falls out really quickly. But with a dam in place, we hold a lot of it, use the storage, and then slowly release it over time. So this chart shows areas within our system that we call flood damage centers. They're sensitive areas that if a flood were to occur, there would be a lot of economic impacts and damages. I've circled the ones that are relevant to this area. We've got Kingsport, which is here, and we've got Elizabethton. So Elizabethton is situated at the confluence of the Doe River and the Watauga River. And so because of that hot spot where those 2 rivers come together, and with the city being right there, there's some economic impacts. Kingsport, similar position. The large driver for this area is pretty obvious. Anybody want to take a stab at what the most damages for Kingsport would be from? Exactly. So Eastman is situated directly below Fort Pat. So basically if there were any flooding conditions at all, Eastman has all kinds of problems. And there are tremendous economic impacts in this area. So it's very, very, very important that we do the best we can to not let anything happen to Kingsport. So I mentioned the storage control aspect of our tributary storage dams. So South Holston is the chart you see here. This is a plot of South Holston's lake level, the black line. So from left to right, you're looking from January to December. And so you can see, like, this is just from this past year. It was really low in the winter, and then it's high in the summer. And so, talking about how it's like you have more of the runoff in the winter, that's the very reason we draw these lakes down. So, every year we have these seasonal cycles. We draw the lakes down as a risk mitigation. So we mitigate the risk of having large spikes of runoff. And when that does happen, we store it all in these lakes. So throughout the year, we have these targets. And if you can see it, there's a green line there. That's kind of what we're trying to follow. And it's a statistical average of where we need to be throughout the year. But we'll get these big spikes and storms in the winter, and the pool will shoot up. But we go through this process of that's by design. We do that to help mitigate downstream impacts and store the water. And then we slowly release it over time. And here's the exact same chart for Watauga. It's a very similar picture where it's lower in the winter, higher in the summer. We're able to raise it in the summer for recreation, and I'll talk about that later, but it's kind of a risk mitigation. We can do it if it's the risk allows it. So we're able to raise it in the summer and lower it in the winter. Boone is also operated in a similar fashion. Thank goodness recently we've returned it to normal operating conditions. It's been down for quite a long time, but we've gotten the green light to operate as normal. So Boone is totally back into its normal operating range, and we'll be raising it about 20 feet every year. So some of these reservoirs can fluctuate large amounts, like depending on how deep they are and how much water they store. I think Douglas can fluctuate like 40 feet, so it's kind of shocking if you're not used to seeing that. So the thing that's different about this chart, this is for Fort Patrick Henry. It doesn't have that same pattern. And I mentioned how it was a different type of dam. It was what we call a run-of-the-river dam. Fort Pat has the main purpose of being used to generate power. It has no ability to store any water for flood control, but it can be used to generate power, and it also has the ability to help support Eastman. You know, it's a really core function to how we operate Fort Pat is to provide water for Eastman. And then the forgotten Little Wilbur Dam just below Watauga Dam. It's on the Watauga River, so if you ever are looking up releases of what's going on in the Watauga River, it's actually coming out of Wilbur Dam. But Wilbur has the same conditions as Fort Patrick Henry, where there's so little storage, it just has to pass whatever we give it. But you can kind of see how we operate within a tight boundary there. This recent drawdown you see was actually an opportunity that just happened. And this is kind of an example of how we do things that are outside the norm. When these sub-zero temperatures we just had recently, we have vegetation on this reservoir. We did a special drawdown there to freeze that vegetation. So we brought it out of the water by lowering the reservoir, froze, and then we brought it back up. So there's a unique little opportunity there to do that. So speaking of the sub-zero temperatures that we just had recently, that was unprecedented. We had system-wide temperatures of like 8 degrees for like 4 or 5 days. Hydropower was off the charts valuable during that event, and it just demonstrated why, and I'm going to talk about it. So within TVA's generating assets, hydropower is only about 9% of that entire portfolio. So as a slice of the pie, it's a small amount of capacity, but that's not the value of hydro. Its capacity is about 3,600 megawatts, and during those peak loads we just saw on our grid in the TVA system, they were about 33,000 megawatts. So very small amount, but big impacts in other ways. I mentioned the Raccoon Mountain Pump Storage Facility in Chattanooga. That actually has a lot of capacity. It's about 1,600 megawatts, which is actually more than a nuclear unit. A nuclear unit can run about 1,200 megawatts. But the thing is it's very limited in the ability of when you can use it. So it's like a rapid discharge battery. Raccoon Mountain is essentially a large battery. We can pump the water up to the top of the mountain when the power is cheap in the morning, and then we can generate with it later when it's more expensive. So even though there's like an efficiency loss by pumping it to the top, it's actually economical to use it when power is more valuable, which is later in the day, usually in the peak loads. And that kind of goes into talk about why hydro is so valuable. Hydro is utilized to meet peak demand. So you'll have a load profile in the morning and when it's cold, where everyone's heat and air is kicking on and the loads in the system kind of increase. And then it kind of decreases in the middle of the day as people leave and go to work. And then later on when they return home, the loads pick back up. So that's kind of a winter regime. In the summer, you have just building temperatures all day. And so in the afternoon, at like 6 o'clock in the evening, you'll have peak loads and you'll see different types of load profiles. So depending on the time of the year, you'll see us running the rivers in a similar way, as long as it makes sense and doesn't compete with these other objectives. So generally hydropower, this time of year, you'll see morning generation and then afternoon generation. And that's kind of the driving factor behind that. And then in the summer, you'll see those afternoon flows. So if you're looking at the schedules on the website like that, be mindful and pay attention, and you might notice that that's kind of the reason why, and you can kind of predict what we're going to run maybe. So hydro is clean, it's renewable, and it's most of all free. Like the fuel source for hydro is rainfall, and it costs us absolutely nothing. The cost is the capital investment for the dam. They're there, so it's free at this point. So another objective is water supply. Regarding water supply, it's not something in the River Forecast Center that we have to often think about. And the reason I say that is because it's kind of baked into our policy. We have about 700 water intakes across the valley, and really our job is to make sure that those water intakes are submerged. And I'm referring to drinking water intakes or industrial intakes, like Eastman is a good example. So we just have to make sure that those are properly submerged below their design boundaries. And as far as like what we do, we have operations and policies baked into place that make sure that is occurring. So using Eastman as an example, Fort Patrick Henry, we have a policy that runs that dam every 3 hours. So that dam should never really turn off. We're always pushing some water down, and it maintains the minimum flow requirement there at Eastman. Oh, another relevant example for this in the region is South Holston. So something we might do is if South Holston received a lot of water and we have to pass water through a different area other than through the hydroelectric turbine, we actually have to notify the Bristol utility there and let them know that we're doing that because there's actually problems with manganese deep in the lake. So because we're pulling water from a different area, they have to alter their treatment process, and that's kind of like a role that we play there is whenever we do that, we notify them. So we also have a lot of stakeholder communication and examples just like that. So regarding the water quality objective, we have MPDS permits, which is a TDEC subset of EPA requirement for thermal limits. So we have an entire staff of engineers, like I think there's 6 or 7 of them, and their entire job is to watch and model discharges from coal and nuclear plants into the river. So they're monitored by permits. We have these thermal models, which you can see in the bottom left, that show exactly where heat is in the system, and we document it and track all of that. Also regarding water quality, in the River Forecast Center, we monitor aeration. So that's important for biodiversity and river fish species and like basically having good dissolved oxygen is going to mean that you're going to have a healthy biological ecosystem. So what we do in the River Forecast Center is operate 4 different types of aeration equipment. This is a program that we started in 1991 out of really being proactive. Like at the time, there was no reason to start this. It was something that TVA took initiative with and started doing on their own. So they were one of the first. And then in 2004, we baked this aeration program into our operating policy. So now it's actually like a requirement. What ended up happening was later on, other organizations are now required to get permitting for this. So TVA, because of the initiative, is sort of just like an industry leader in this, actually. We invest about $17 million of capital and then about $3 million annual operating expenses for these systems. A large portion of that comes from our liquid oxygen program, and I'll kind of talk about that, but what it is we have these diffuser lines that are essentially garden soaker hoses, more or less. They're more designed than that, but I'm just kind of using that as an example. And we take liquid oxygen, truck it into a site and as liquid, and we convert it to a gas and bubble it into the lake. So that raises the oxygen there in the lake, and then that water is passed downstream. So we closely monitor this at all times, 24/7, and it helps keep the fish and everybody happy. Some other options we use is we just have the option to open a vent within the actual unit, and it just injects air. So like any turbulence in the unit makes it oxygenate, so that helps too. And then we also have pumps, surface water pumps that just sit at the backside of the dam on the lake and push the highly oxygenated water deeper into the water, down towards the discharge. So recreation, this is the one that I think probably impacts people the most. We get a lot of people calling us and talking about recreation, and it's something that you spend a lot of your time doing, Like for example, if you're a fly fisherman, like maybe some of you go to South Holston and fly fish there, or maybe some of you have like been down the Watauga River on a kayak or something like that. So this is a very personal thing for a lot of people. But you know, I kind of want to mention that this is kind of woven into all these other objectives. So it's kind of challenging for us in the Forecast Center to balance all these objectives because they kind of compete with each other. Like a fly fisherman, for example, they want the water low so they can go out and wade into the river, whereas a rafter wants it high so they can go and kayak. So we'll get a lot of feedback from people that want things the way they want them, but you know, we live in a group where can't make everybody happy, but we try to do the best we can. So I mentioned the lake levels being higher in the summer on that previous chart. We do that because the risk allows it. We don't have a high risk of big floods in the summer, so we can actually afford to raise the lakes higher and allow anybody to get out there and enjoy boating. So you know, that benefits property owners nearby, economic development, and that kind of thing. We also have like specific scheduled releases. Every year we push a calendar out to the TVA website, and it talks about like a certain time on any given day that we're going to release water to a certain thing. So I'll mention Watauga because it's the one relevant here. We have a scheduled release at Watauga every week in the summer from Memorial Day to Labor Day that we have basically a scheduled flow which benefits people who want to kayak. We do not have an official tailwater release at South Holston, but South Holston, pretty commonly, all we do is we'll run the unit and then go off for about 8 to 12 hours, and that's a schedule we push to the website. So it's very easy to look up, or you can call us, and that kind of allows people to like make their plans and go out there. But we don't have any like dedicated schedule release there. Other places we have that at are Norris, Appalachia Dam, the entire Ocoee system, Timms Ford, and an Upper Bear Creek, which is a non-power dam out in northwest Alabama. I mentioned the Ocoees. It's kind of a unique thing. When TVA was created, some of these dams, I believe Ocoee 2 for sure, was acquired. And over the years, it's kind of morphed into this unique aspect of our system. They're these old dams, and they're very, very interesting the way they're built. But we have commitments there to provide whitewater rafting. So, you know, if you've ever been there, you can hop on the raft like these people on the right and take a stroll down the river. It's not for the faint of heart. And then the upper one we actually had at the Olympics back in the 90s, so we provided the Olympic flows there for them. This is just a schedule of like the Watauga Wilbur generation releases. So if you were to go to the website, you'd find a chart that just looks like this. So you can see each day has got its circle of what we're going to be putting out. And that kind of wraps up the overview, and I want to kind of leave that open now for just a discussion and Q&A if anybody has questions.